I want to call the meeting to order, the September 13th, 2022 Board of Directors meeting for the South Carolina Water and Sewer Authority. With that, I want to welcome everyone here. Thank you for being here tonight. And those that didn't have any choice in the matter, and those that came voluntarily. We appreciate all of you being here. And with that, we'll go to our roll call. Mr. Troy.
Very good, thank you. Commissioner Way,
Present.
Commissioner McLean,
Present.
Councilperson McCullough,
Present.
Commissioner Karen,
Present.
Councilperson Linda Jordan,
Present.
Vice Chair Ms. Kaczynski,
Present.
and Chairman Jimmy Gooch.
Present.
Thank you.
And if you will, please join me in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight to conduct business for the South Carolina Water and Sewer Authority. We greatly appreciate all the blessings you've given us, and we ask those blessings on everyone here tonight and everyone who sees and hears this meeting. We ask that everyone receive the information that's going to be given here tonight with open ears and open mind, and judge it accordingly. We thank you for all that you've allowed us to accomplish. We ask that everything we do be a blessing in your eyes. In the name of your Son, amen.
Amen.
And with that, the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And our next item is adjustments or approval of the meeting agenda. Does anyone have any adjustments? If not,
Make a motion to approve the meeting agenda as is.
we have a motion to approve the meeting
Second.
agenda as is, and a second. Although, any discussion on the motion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No, motion carries. And next we have review and approval of minutes from the August 9th, 2022 meeting. I trust everyone's had time to look these over. Is there any comments or questions about the minutes?
I move we adopt the minutes as written.
We have a motion to approve the minutes. Do I hear a second?
Second.
We have a second. Is there any discussion on the motion? Being no discussion, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it, motion carries. Our next item on the agenda is public comments. Is anyone here signed up for public comments?
Mr. Chair, we did not receive any public comments requests this evening.
Okay. Thank you. And with that, we'll move on to board discussion items.
I have a quick question. Mr. Mayo sent all of us an email. Was there an email sent to SGWASA about a public comment
When did you receive the email?
It
today?
was today. He said he had already submitted public comments, but he was forwarding us an email, so we would have it.
I haven't been on top of my emails this afternoon, been tied up.
Not sure if I saw that this afternoon while I was setting up the board meeting, but I will check it for the record.
Did you know what time he sent this message?
4:37.
Oh, 4:37.
An email from a citizen.
But I said, pull it up.
It won't open either, am I?
Yeah, it won't open on. Were you able to open it?
I was.
I
You were?
can't-
I was not.
I was not.
You couldn't
Me
open
either. I
the,
can't
some of the
open the
attachments, but
attachments.
the email, I could see it.
Right.
I guess we'll have to, it's something we have to open on the laptop or computer somewhere. Wasn't open on the phones. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say if it was sent to the board secretary, I should have a copy of that in the mailbox. I can take a look at that, maybe when we take a break at some point, and then I can also make sure that I get that in front of the board or forward that to the board as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
No No problem. I wasn't aware of it, and thank you for bringing it to my attention. And, you know, his comments will be included in the minutes. And the next item we have is board discussion items. And it appears we have no board discussion items for tonight, so we'll move on to, item number 9, our presentation by Hazen and Sawyer.
Or more.
Or more.
Or Mark. Happy to be here. Item number 9 on the agenda tonight is PFAS. This is a topic that I brought up at the last board meeting. I mentioned that this was an EPA item. They came to our attention, some of their health advisory limits changed. I'm not going to get into too much detail myself. We've got our consultant here tonight who's working on this. We have representatives from Hazen. These are the engineers, this is the consultant that worked with us on the water treatment plant upgrade project. David Briley is here. I work with him a lot on that project. So they did a great job on that. And also here tonight is Alex Borzowski. And with that, I'll just turn the presentation over to them. I think what we're going to do, they'll go through a few slides and then we'll stop at certain points and give everyone a chance for questions at that point instead of wait to the end. We'll just take questions throughout. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And yeah, appreciate inviting us in to talk about PFAS. Yeah, this has been in the news a lot over the last several years, especially after EPA took some action to revise the health advisory limit back in 2016. So there was a lot of water systems, and unfortunately, North Carolina is kind of on the radar for PFAS. And so there's a lot of water systems, particularly in the Cape Fear River Basin, that have had to pay attention to this issue a lot since then. Now recent EPA action with revising that health advisory level again back in June now it's got everybody's attention. So yeah, we had a discussion with Scott and Mark not too long ago about trying to be proactive and stay out in front of this as much as we can. And so wanted to kind of present to you tonight and talk about kind of an initial plan of action forward. So we're going to give you a little bit of background. I'm not sure how much you may know, but we'll give a very brief background on kind of what PFAS is and what the current kind of guidance and rules are related to PFAS and what actions we are anticipating, and you know where have PFAS been detected, which is almost everywhere, and then kind of a summary of what initial steps that we plan to take to again kind of stay in front of this and understand how this might impact SGWASA. So PFAS, especially in the media, have been often referred to as forever chemicals, which is kind of an unfortunate nickname, but also it's kind of well earned. These are man-made chemicals. These are not natural in any form, and they're fairly ubiquitous. Go to the next slide. I think there's a couple other animations. There's last count I heard maybe over 5,000 different chemicals. So PFAS kind of covers a whole group of chemicals that are used in a lot of consumer products. PFOA and PFOS were banned, about 20 years ago. The EPA got concerned about their toxicity, which a lot of that comes through accumulation in the body, and so manufacturers just switch to other compounds. As I mentioned, there's thousands of them out there. Scott, keep going. I think there's a couple other animations. So they just replace them with what we call shorter chain compounds. Gen X is one that we hear a lot about in North Carolina. And so sources are kind of all over the map. I mean, PFAS are used in the making of nonstick cookware. Firefighting foams is another big one we see in pizza boxes. And so in terms of water and wastewater treatment, the sources we see coming into our water supplies are coming from industrial sources, landfills. They can be in biosolids, runoff from certain areas. And as I mentioned, they're fairly ubiquitous. When you see reports that, we're detecting PFAS in the blood of polar bears, we know it's kind of whole, everywhere, not just in highly developed societies. The next slide, please. So PFAS, to get a little technical with you for a moment, it has a covalent carbon fluoride bond, and that is an extremely strong chemical bond, and that's what gives the chemical a lot of its properties, which makes it very desirable from, if you're a chemical engineer, and that these compounds are pretty resistant to biodegradation, to oxidation, to really almost kind of thermal stability, which makes them very stable. And unfortunately, they kind of survive in the environment for a long period of time. Next slide, please. They're also mobile, and as I mentioned before, what really contributes to their toxicity is the fact that they bioaccumulate in the body. The body can't expel PFAS that quickly, and so PFOA and PFOS in particular, and that's why EPA kind of targeted those compounds and tried to get them, stop production of them, is just such the slow elimination rate in the body. And so we switched to shorter chain compounds. From a water treatment perspective, the shorter chain PFAS have been found to be even more challenging to treat, unfortunately. And so PFAS, the accumulation has been linked to, a number of health effects. More recently, we've seen, even affecting vaccine response and also COVID vaccines in the population. Next slide, please. So really what kind of brings us here today was the more recent action by the EPA. Back in June, they revised the health advisory limits for two of these compounds, PFOS and PFOA. Again, as I mentioned, they had taken an action and reduced them back in 2016. Additional research and studies had further kind of shed light on the impacts of these compounds. So to revise those levels down again. A health advisory limit is basically just guidance. It is not enforceable. So this is not a regulatory standard at the moment. And they reduced those numbers down to 0.02 parts per trillion for PFOS, and PFOA is 0.004 parts per trillion, which parts per trillion is the same thing as nanograms per liter. So it's very low. A lot of our other standards that we're worried about are in milligrams per liter. So extremely low levels. They also set health advisory level for another compound, PFBS, and then GenX did not have a health advisory limit at the federal level. North Carolina, because of our unfortunate issue with GenX in the Cape Fear River, did already have a health advisory limit of 140 parts per trillion, but now there's a federal health advisory limit at 10. Next slide, please. And so we're expecting EPA to issue a draft MCL for those two compounds, PFOA and PFOS, by the end of the year. I have to admit, I can't really explain the logic behind issuing a revised health advisory for those two compounds in June when you have a regulatory standard coming out. But it has created a lot of confusion amongst customers, amongst water systems about how to deal with PFAS. And those health advisory levels are below what our current detection limits are, which kind of puts us in a position of we can't prove that we don't have it. So to make it even more confusing for everyone involved. So next slide, please. So with that, Alex is going to come through and kind of talk through the rest of the presentation a little bit more about the regulatory actions that are coming. Yes, sir.
If you don't mind, the question I've got is related to what you just said about detection level. I know it wasn't very long ago, your normal labs didn't have equipment measuring parts per billion. And even 3 years ago, in order to measure in parts per billion, it was so difficult to calibrate the equipment that you had to come up with an average. You had to run the sample 3 or 4 times to get an average to come up with parts per billion. And I was just wondering, how do you come up with parts per trillion?
Yeah, well, and on the screen, this kind of shows you right there, the federal minimum reporting limit, which is fairly close to the detection limit. Some labs have a little bit lower detection limit, but the health advisory level is orders of magnitude less than what we can reliably detect in a lab. And even at that level, the sampling requirements are pretty unique. Because such slight contamination can mess up the results, like, don't stop by Bojangles and get a biscuit out of that wrapper, which might have PFAS on it, or don't wear deodorant, which makes it really challenging when you're riding with your buddy in the car to go sample.
No
And
lotion,
so
no lotion on your hands?
No lotion, yeah, they're
And
pretty strict
What
requirements.
about your
because
gloves? You
There's
you
very
have require
specific, yeah,
special
gloves that
gloves?
you have to use. So yeah, when we're dealing with nanograms per liter, it doesn't take much contamination to affect the results.
Thank you.
All right, now.
So, good evening, everyone. Just wanted to add on to the chairman's question. So one way in which we can measure so low is we take a sample of water, fairly large, pass it through something that's going to concentrate all of that. It's called solid phase extraction. And then we can remove that. So we basically take a sample, concentrate it down, so a big volume ends up in a small volume, and that's how you're able to get these really low detection limits. But it's still, we're still not able to detect as low as these health advisory levels are. So that's one of the fundamental challenges we're kind of facing as a field right now. But as David mentioned, there's not currently any state or federal guidance for PFAS. And when there's guidance, there's not any regulation. So these things are not yet enforceable. But the state does have a provisional health goal, and there's some federal health advisories. So this table we're showing you has 4 different chemicals on it: PFOA, PFOS, Gen X, and PFBS. So in the state of North Carolina, all we had to go by was this provisional health goal for Gen X, which was really targeted at the Cape Fear River, folks down in Wilmington, that area. These new health advisory levels came out for PFOA, PFOS. They're very low. And we're not just looking at the health advisory level, we're looking at the minimum reporting limit. So the advisory level is 1,000 times lower than the minimum reporting limit for PFOA, which puts us in this really challenging position of how can we prove that we're below that level? So I wanted to mention these to you because when we go out and we collect samples, we're gonna get results. The question is, if we look for something, we're probably gonna find it at these really low concentrations. What is the relevance of that information we find? What's the public health protection that we're looking for guidance? So what's out there right now does not currently take into account treatment limitations, anything like that. These are just guidance that is set at a very low level. And is meant to kind of say below this level, we know that there's no bad effect, but above that level, there still might not be significant health impact, but we're kind of waiting to go through the regulatory process to find that out. Next slide, please. So what is a health advisory level? The definition is a concentration at or below which adverse health effects are not anticipated to occur. So that's a little bit different than an MCL or a regulation. So when we develop a regulation, EPA will go through and they'll look at the public health benefits and they'll weigh the treatment feasibility, cost, monitoring limitations, all those kind of things, and come up with a maximum contaminant level or MCL. So we're not there just yet. All we have is kind of these guidance concentration. So in June, we got these new health advisory levels, non-regulatory, non-enforceable. And then just a couple of weeks ago, at the end of August, PFOA and PFOS were designated as hazardous substances. And so that includes some monitoring requirements for industries that might discharge those, things like fabric manufacturers, landfills, and people who use aqueous film forming foams and wastewater treatment plants as well. like David mentioned, later this year, we're looking at having a draft of those maximum contaminant levels, and those will be regulatory and enforceable when they go into effect, and we're expecting those to be finalized next fall. So kind of a very fast pace of regulatory development.
So by looking at this map, it looks like there's more states that are up north and there's only 3 that are not up north. Well, why is the concentration more up north?
So the EPA's process in developing these regulations took a little while, and there were some states that kind of wanted to get ahead of EPA, and they thought that they were moving a little bit too slowly. So there are some states that took action on their own ahead of the federal government. And so you'll see that in states like North Carolina, New Jersey, Massachusetts, New York, and California, amongst some others. So those are the first ones who started developing new regulatory concentrations. These guidance levels from the federal government are lower than any other states that have provided guidance levels for this.
Almost all of those northern states that I see on this map have mandatory recycling in them. I know because I used to live there. And we do not in North Carolina, we don't have mandatory recycling. Do you believe that mandatory recycling in those northern states has made any kind of an effect?
I can't.
I mean,
say
I know
for
it's not
sure.
just
Yeah.
coming from that.
Yeah, usually there's a couple sources we typically look for. You know, it's proximity to military bases. Because oftentimes the foams that we use to put out fires and jet fuel, which are common in military bases, are a source. So we look at military bases, we look at landfills, we look at other potential industrial sources. So industries that use PFAS, usually we don't necessarily see it in recycling centers, but from waste streams that might end up diverted to landfills, we do see them in landfill leachate.
So if there's a regulatory enforceable rule coming out in late 2022,
Trying to get at.
do we have equipment to measure this?
So we have equipment to measure the contaminants down to, let's say, about 2 parts per trillion. So if you go back just one more slide. So the health advisory levels are much lower than 2. They're at 0.004, 0.02. Those are not currently detectable by the methods that we have. Anything below about 1 or 2, we cannot reliably detect.
Okay. Thank you.
So not to make this a political type thing, it appears that there's more Democratic states that have pushed ahead of the EPA.
I mean, there's been a number of drivers in different states. So for some states in North Carolina, it was Chemours and Gen X, you know, it was some research that was done by NC State that brought this issue to the forefront. So we knew about it and that became a specific driver. You know, a lot of times it's individual specific drivers in states that push things, you know, a lot of military bases, you know, New Jersey's on there, there's a lot of chemical manufacturing in New Jersey. So I think that oftentimes is the driver. Minnesota's on this map. That's 3M was responsible for a lot of contamination in some communities. So it also tends to kind of coincide with a lot of industrial activity, right? So I've designed a few treatment plants in California, and those are usually historical industrial contamination. So it's where you're around those historical sources that are oftentimes the drivers that lead the state to take actions prior to the federal government.
So where do you see these numbers eventually landing? Because you're saying that nobody can detect this low as of right now. So where do you see these numbers landing?
It's a little bit tough to say at this point. I mean, these health advisory levels were certainly much lower than any of us were anticipating prior to them being released. I will say that there are concentrations in other states that say the 5 to 6 nanograms per liter level. So California has implemented those that are about 5 and 6. We see those coming out that way. I think a lot of the expectation is it could be in the low single digits. Oftentimes, you know, we talk about MCLs and MCLGs. G is the goal. You know, the goal does not take into account analytical feasibility to measure that load, doesn't take into account feasibility to treat. It's just if we could ideally treat things as well as we wanted to, where would we get to? So for a lot of contaminants out there, that number is 0. So you can kind of think of this, at least the way I think through these health advisories, is ideally the number would be 0, but treatment may not allow us to get to 0. Analytical methods may not allow us to get there. And it may not be cost effective to pass that on to our ratepayers to try and treat down to zero. And so that's where the MCL comes in. So I think these really low numbers are kind of the goal of where we would ideally be if money were no object, if we had the analytical capability and so forth. But the MCL is going to have to balance that cost and public health benefit. And so that could be in the, single digit part per trillion range, but it's hard to say for sure exactly where that'll fit.
Thank you.
Good question. So certainly a lot of momentum in developing regulations. So this is a map showing where PFAS have been detected. And you see a lot of dots in certain states, and part of the reason we were talking about, the Northeast seems to have a lot of development. Oftentimes, if the state chooses to monitor for PFAS, they find it. So North Carolina, statewide monitoring was done. That's why you can see the outline of the state of North Carolina in here very well. Massachusetts and New Jersey have statewide monitoring. That's why you see those. In Minnesota, you look up around the Twin Cities, that's where 3M was dumping PFOA for many years. California, you also see a lot of, they do not require statewide monitoring, but if you're within some distance of a landfill or a military base, you are required to monitor. Then some utilities kind of monitor it on their own. So wherever people have kind of looked for PFAS, they found it, is sort of the story here. And our detection limits for these chemicals are getting very, very low. And so that's why oftentimes when we look for them in industrialized areas, we tend to find them. And we talked about these really low health advisory levels. There is some limited data on sources for SGWASA. There's monitoring done by the North Carolina PFAS testing network that was done through NC State, Duke University, University of North Carolina some years ago. And they went around and they sampled for PFOA and PFOS in all the public water systems in the state, including this one. So the slide on the left is showing you concentration in nanograms per liter of PFOA and PFOS. So this is just one sample, one snapshot in time. And prior to June, that health advisory level was that the sum of those should be less than 7. So the orange line at the top shows you 70. So prior to June 2020, the only data we had suggested that you were, at less than half of the regulatory, or I shouldn't say regulatory, the guidance level for PFOA and PFOS. And that guidance level changed very significantly in June, so it, triggered a lot of media coverage that no longer looked at them as a combination, but looked at them individually. And so the plots on the right slide here are showing you PFOA and PFOS with these new very low health advisory levels. So the one data point we have in time exceeds those health advisory levels and exceeds the reporting limits for them. But it's something that, has been on the radar, but it was known to be lower than the health advisory level until that health advisory level was lowered by a factor of 10,000, 100,000. So things changed, significantly, and that's why this is kind of gained a lot more attention and why we're looking to assist in developing the monitoring plans to find out how consistent is this and where might it be coming from. So I'll pause there because I know that's a couple of plots on the slide there. I wanted to see if there's any questions about current data.
So what the public really wants to hear, is there any reason for them to be alarmed at this water the way it is today?
So we have, a very kind of fluid development in terms of what are the advisory levels that are proposed. I should note that these are lifetime health advisory levels. So they're based around assumptions that include 70 years of exposure, 70 years of drinking the water. So they're not meant that if you exceed this at a specific point in time, that there's an imminent danger. So when these advisory levels are developed, EPA can set them for short periods of time, a few weeks, or a lifetime. And these are lifetime advisories. So the risk that EPA is assuming a very long period of exposure, not an imminent, very short period of exposure.
Who's life?
So
It's
That's
an
the
assumption of
question.
70 years.
Who's life?
70 years is your life expectancy.
Drinking 2
I think
beers.
it's 2 left.
You've got 2 years left.
He just said that it's 70.
Yeah, it's 70 years, 2 liters, a half gallon of water a day for 70 years with some
Okay.
set factor of safety in there.
Changed my life.
So we're looking strictly at SGWASA here. What is it like with other places? Is everybody experiencing about the same level or higher levels, or what do you see and what's trending?
I've been looking at a lot of other data for, utilities, well, particularly in, the Piedmont of North Carolina. And these levels here are not unusual for, your neighboring utilities. I will say they are a lot lower than utilities in Cape Fear River. Though they're facing, a lot higher levels of these two compounds and others, kind of throughout that, Hall River, Cape Fear River Basin. And so there's, a number of utilities down there that, have had to take it, Wilmington and Brunswick County have both put in treatment systems. There's others up in the Cape Fear River that are in the process of doing it or looking at it because they're facing much higher levels. These are close to what you'll see in some other, neighboring utilities.
General area in this region?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you speak to the treatment facilities? How do you get this out, basically?
Yeah, that's a great question. So probably the three most common technologies that are used to deal with PFAS are, one is activated carbon absorption. That is the path that Wilmington, Cape Fear Public Utility Authority, has a system that's being constructed and will go online in the next month or two. It's about to go online. Brunswick County put in reverse osmosis. That is less common because it doesn't actually it removes it from the water that you send to your customers. It concentrates it into the stream that you put back into the river. So that has some obvious limitations, particularly if you're higher up in the basin. The folks downstream may not appreciate that. So from a permitting perspective, I could see that would be kind of a challenge, because now all of a sudden, it would be your pipe putting it, you can. So we don't see that one as common, at least in North Carolina. Ion exchange is another one that's used. Again, it kind of acts like activated carbon, that it is absorbing PFAS onto the media. And I've been involved in several PFAS treatment kind of on this side of the world, in Alabama, North Carolina. Alex did a number of them in California. We didn't fly him in from California. We actually got lucky. He moved here about 2 months ago, and decided he wants to raise a family here in Raleigh. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah.
Because he's been with us for a number of years. And then you can go on the internet and you will find a lot of other treatment technologies that are being developed and you've probably seen articles not too long ago about other treatment schemes that are being worked on, that are being researched, that, some of them show promise in a lab level, that they're still working on scale up, and there'll be a lot more attention to alternative treatment technologies.
So do we have what date this was tested?
I don't know it offhand. We do know the day that it was tested. And so one of the things that we're looking to do as part of a project is to collect some more samples and find out, was this, a one-time event, or are these concentrations consistently high?
Was it contaminated? We don't know how it was gathered.
Right. Yeah, one data point doesn't tell a story.
Right.
Yep, and sample, it was, collected by the university. They were running a lot of different samples, so, they tested everywhere all over the state. So it doesn't give you the kind of consistency that you'd like to look for. And so there's a component of this of, is it consistently this high? And can we identify, is it a source that can be controlled? So for example, for some wastewater treatment plants in Michigan, for example, they identified a couple of industrial sources that were contributing to those wastewater treatment plants. They can put down an industrial pre-treatment permit that requires them to treat for those. they can remove it from the source over time. And we're working on a project, in Virginia, the western part of the state, where we're helping the utility to identify where are these different PFAS coming from. They're kind of an intermittent discharge, and we're hoping we can help them identify, because it costs the utility a lot less to get that polluter to stop contributing it to the source than it does to install treatment. You're not transferring that cost to your customers. And it's also something that can be implemented a lot more quickly than a new capital improvement program.
What reason did Wilmington give for using the activated carbon process other than reverse osmosis?
They did pilot testing of ion exchange and activated carbon. And, you know, that data led them to decide that activated carbon was going to be the best approach for them.
What do they do with activated carbon filters after they're polluted with excessive amounts of PFAS and PFAS?
So activated carbon can be regenerated. You can send that back to, you know, most suppliers have regeneration facilities where they heat up the carbon, and, you know, drive the contaminants off. And of course, that piece of it in air quality has been looked at, but is being looked at now pretty closely. But one of the major suppliers of carbon started doing testing years ago, and they kind of determined what temperature, which I believe is like 1200, that you have to get above 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. And at that point, you're not only driving the contaminants off the carbon, but actually breaking them down. And then you can bring that carbon back and put it back into your facility. Now, ion exchange, well, particularly California uses a lot of ion exchange for softening and other things. And well, Johnston County has an ion exchange that removes organics. Most ion exchange, you can just regenerate it right there on site. But in this kind of application, you cannot regenerate, and basically you send that ion exchange resin off to be incinerated.
So you can do incineration, you can do hazardous waste landfill, same thing with the GAC. It's important to note that these are provided as a turnkey service by the vendor. So David was talking about the activated carbon vendor, ion exchange vendors. They provide it, they offload that material into a treatment facility, they take it out and they dispose of it. Now, the utility does pay for that, but the goal is for the utility not to own the liability of that GAC or ion exchange that has PFAS on it. So when that's disposed, it's the responsibility of the vendor to dispose of that material in a way that is safe and that it's not re-released into the environment.
So it sounds like whatever you do, short of incinerate it, you're concentrating it, and if you don't incinerate it, it somehow finds its way right back into the environment.
Potentially. So
And even if you incinerate it, there's the air quality issues.
And up reverse osmosis, there's the water quality, but the amount that's wasted.
Yeah.
Like I said, air quality, that's a regulatory process that is not complete. You know, they're still looking at it. As Alex mentioned, there was a proposed rule under CERCLA to regulate PFAS. And that's just a proposed rule, and I think they're even still looking at it under RCRA. But CERCLA is basically the Superfund regulation, right?
So basically, if you use reverse osmosis, you're really just taking it out of drinking water, but you're putting it back in the environment.
You didn't take it out of the sun. Yeah, you put
Concentrated
it right back.
method.
And along
So
with-
it's a full circle.
Correct. And reverse osmosis also carries the challenge that the water that comes through reverse osmosis is more corrosive than the water that currently goes into your pipes. So it's important to manage the distribution system water quality so that you don't corrode the pipes out in your system.
Which is really important given the increased attention to lead and copper with those rule revisions.
Yes.
So
Yes, the new lead and copper rule.
So who is the federal government setting the regulations for how to filter out these PFAS? Or is there an accepted process versus, do they accept both of these or do they accept one over another? Is the government going to set a standard and say you got to do it with carbon not osmosis?
That has interestingly enough come up as of late. We're not exactly sure. Right now, all three technologies have been installed. And so at minimum, there will be a variance granted to those that use those technologies. A lot of times, the ultimate decision comes down to the state. So when we've designed these before, usually what we do is we come up with a preliminary design concept. We review that with the state regulator. You know, I've got one of those meetings next week. We talk through it, we say, this is how we'd like to design the system, this is the technology that we're planning to use. Do you have any comments? We give the state an opportunity to comment early on in the process, make sure they're on board before we go through with the design and construction. And then ultimately they issue a permit that allows you to use that treatment technology. So the federal government issues kind of guidance to the states, but ultimately it will be the state issuing the permit.
Okay, thank you.
There is a possibility, that EPA one day may implement a rule that has a treatment technique instead of just a standard. I don't know if it'll happen now. It's being talked about now, but I think in their kind of recognition that there's thousands of compounds, and are we really gonna go set tons of standards that, they're actually considering kind of establishing a treatment technique that you have, you know, probably one of these accepted methods for treatment installed at your facility, as opposed to a whole bunch of standards. I know that's still being talked about now. We don't know what's gonna come out, later this fall.
Okay. Question. So from a consumer perspective, what I hear is that some consumers are thinking that they could get a water filter system and that would potentially help. Is that beneficial or does it do anything at all from your perspective?
That's a great question. So again, GACs, can be very effective. But it could give I guess a false sense of security, because there's a lot of these different compounds that break through, or basically exhaust carbon at different rates. And there's a lot of devil in those details. So I don't think you can just read on a box and say that this will last for 3 months or 4 months and really be assured that you're getting the treatments that you were hoping for.
Right. Because then they have to dispose of it properly.
Right. And then, of course,
And if
You
you
know,
dispose of it, and it goes into
The
landfill,
landfill.
Comes right back.
it's
Comes right back.
concentrated and it comes right back around.
and of course, you're a water and sewer authority and we're water treatment engineers, so we're just talking about the water side, but there's a lot of other pathways to get exposed to PFAS, which, I feel like maybe be a little overshadowed by all the news focusing on the water and wastewater side.
And
right
look, even though your landfills are lined, there's water at the bottom that condensate that has to be pulled off, and usually that's all to wastewater treatment plant. And there again, whatever comes through, just, it makes a cycle right around.
Thank you.
I guess that's why they call them forever chemicals.
It's an unfortunate name, but it's not inaccurate.
Yeah, they're very hard to break down. There's a reason we even put out jet fuel fires, right? They persist. They're very stable compounds.
And it's not only the water that you can find these things in,
Yep.
in
Anything,
our environment.
yes, non-stick surfaces,
Food wrappers,
clothing, yeah,
Teflon pans.
Yeah.
Clothing, upholstery, that's how it became so ubiquitous, kind of across the world, no matter.
What you do, you're gonna find them.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Do we plan on, doing testing?
That is a great segue to this next slide. Great question.
I mean, everybody's asked questions except me. I'm sitting back observing and taking everything. So my question is, when we begin to, I would like to get testing done.
Mhm.
I want to make sure that we're on top of things, especially reading up on stuff and knowing this is old military base area, and we've had some industrial here in this area that's since gone on and things of that nature. As far as the testing goes and the locations where you guys will do the testing, that type of thing, that's what I'm going to be interested in.
All right. Absolutely. He's going to get into that next.
I'm on it.
You see this, Lorenzo?
So it should be noted, there's some federally mandated sampling but, you know, the authority is looking to do sampling. In addition to that, it kind of kicks in for that. So there's something called the fifth unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, or UCMR5. UCMR is really just EPA's way of collecting data throughout the country. So if you serve more than 10,000 people, you'll collect samples through each different round. So I myself worked at a utility through a couple of rounds of these. And, you know, when that time comes, you collect water samples, you ship it off, they analyze it. And that's how EPA gets an occurrence database to know how many water systems are affected by these examples. And so UCMR5 is really all about PFAS. It contains the 4 PFAS that have health advisory levels, plus 25 additional compounds. So a total of 29 compounds. And this rule requires that water systems collect quarterly samples for a 1-year period between 2023 and 2025. So it can start anytime in that period, just has to go 4 consecutive quarters. So that's, you know, a regulation that must be completed by the end of 2025. Next slide. And as part of this project, what we're proposing to do is develop a sampling and analysis plan to verify influent concentrations and identify potential PFAS sources. So for influent concentrations, looking at them over time, like we said, this is just one snapshot in time, collecting additional samples to see if, you know, this is a consistent occurrence or if it kind of comes and goes. Also to identify different sources. So the purple outline you see here is the watershed for the lake. It's got different streams that are tributaries to it. So we can go out and collect samples and identify where these might be coming from. And we'll also advise SGWASA staff on sample collection practices and analytical methods to use. So I've collected some of these samples before. They have very specific things you need to do. Not wear lotions, not wear, you know, water repellent clothing. There's a lot of really specific sampling procedures that go into it to make sure you don't get false positive detections. So we'll then prepare a database that has these different results and prepare a tech memo that summarizes those results and propose some potential next steps to address PFAS. So that's kind of the sampling analysis plan. We're going to look at both what's coming into the treatment plant and different sources throughout the watershed to identify where these might be coming from.
Are we gonna look at what goes out of the water?
We can look at what goes out of the water plant as well, yes. We don't expect that the treatment processes that are currently there will remove a lot of the PFAS from the source. They're only, like Dave mentioned, there's only 3 technologies we typically see that are capable of removing it. So we can look at some different technologies and what might be effective, but typically if you've got conventional state-of-the-art water treatment, unless it contains these 3 technologies, it largely is not that effective for the removal of PFAS.
We don't know the exact timing, but yeah, are expecting to see that draft rule later this year. Somebody asked me a question recently if we thought that EPA may defer to that rulemaking because of political reasons or worried about cost, and it does not seem like that. They put together an action plan years ago in things like the circle rule, and there's a lot of things they're kind of going through and checking off the boxes. And we know our group met last week to still talk about it. So I mean, every indication we have is that it's coming, whether it is the end of this year or goes into early next year. It does seem to be a priority for EPA at the moment.
So there is a testing place that goes this low currently in this area to test this.
No,
So
yeah,
how can we implement something that we can't even test?
would expect that the MCL would be above the detection limit.
Right.
But yeah, not down to those health advisory levels, the 0.00.
They're, like you said, they're non-detectable levels at this point in time.
Right.
Correct. And I think another important thing to know is that the authority staff are trying to be forward thinking and getting ahead of this issue rather than waiting for an MCL to come out, so that, you know, the challenge can be well understood and you'll have the knowledge you need to make an informed decision about how to proceed.
So we have limits that have been set or recommended. but there's no way to test to make sure that you fall below those limits. Am I hearing that correct?
That's correct. Yep, that was what I just asked him.
I wanted to make sure I understood it correctly,
Yeah.
because as many emails and as much information is out there in the community about people talking about these limits, and there is no way to test for these limits currently because there's no lab that's able to do it.
Correct.
That's
Okay,
why the
thank you.
EPA.
I
can't
just
set
want to make sure
regulation.
I heard it right. Thank you very much.
That's why the EPA can't set the regulation.
Not that low, at least. So, yeah, it's a hard implementation. When it came out, a lot of us were all in the same room at the time and kind of looked at each other and.
So any sampling that we do, the results,
Will be zero.
you won't even be able to regulate what their recommendations are because you will not.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
One thing that we haven't said is probably worth saying here is that we are, if they follow their timeline, they plan to have a final rule by the end of next year. We really don't have any indication as to what they're thinking in terms of compliance. So how much longer after the final rule is published, if that is the end of next year, when will they require water systems to be in compliance with whatever that NCL is?
So I'm guessing they have to wait for the technology to catch up so that it can accurately measure before they can actually make it a MCL. Is that correct?
We could make an MCL at the concentrations we can measure today. So we can still measure very low.
Yeah.
And so if they were to make an MCL, it would likely be at a detectable concentration. And then EPA can lower those over time as detection limits improve. Arsenic being one example of this. There's other contaminants over time where the levels have become more stringent as analytical capability improves.
But the advisory levels they came out with, they can't make that a rule because you can't detect that level.
Correct.
Just trying to get it straight.
Kind of like
I
the
have-
Falls Lake rules.
One more question that I do. So the cost to do these charcoal filters on a facility like we currently have would be,
Put you on the spot. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the capital cost for like a GEC contactor.
ballpark figure. I know you can't give me exact.
Yeah, well, I can kind of give you an example based off of like Cape Fear Public Utility Authority started constructing theirs about 2 years ago before the construction market really got completely nuts. It was about $1 a gallon. So 7 MGD facility would be about 7 million to construct. The cost of that media has, with increased demand, has increased about 25% over the last, year or two. So that's another cost that's actually a huge part of that GEC. To your question, like how long does it last and how often do you have to, regenerate it and pay to have that, reactivated?
So you're at $1.25 a gallon right now. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, can't say you're wrong, but yeah. The
Or capital cost.
one at
Just say
Sweeney,
10 million.
and I don't know if I have the
Roughly.
number, the actual date right, but I believe it was bid about 2 years ago. They constructed it at a 44 MGD capacity, and I believe the construction cost was 35 million, not including what they spent for design and then the pilot testing ahead of that. And I don't know those numbers off the top of my head.
So construction would be 5 to 7 billion guesstimate. But then the carbon and the daily cost.
Of course.
Yeah, and all three of these technologies we talked about have some pretty high O&M costs associated with it.
And
Go ahead.
I was just saying ballpark figure, I've done this for a couple of different treatment plants. It really depends on your source water quality. What's coming in, the concentrations, competing things from, naturally occurring organic matter in the water. But typically we see it at about, 10 cents per 1,000 gallons on an O&M basis. And, but it is significant in terms of, relative to the cost of treatment. Other places we've seen it comparable to say utilities chemical cost or their electrical cost, depending on the utility. So it can be a significant amount, but it really depends on how long it lasts. And there is everybody's trying to develop better GACs, better resins, so we're hoping that O&M costs will come down over time.
As a part of the infrastructure law that was passed last year, that law included $5 billion in funding to help deal with emerging contaminants like PFAS. Not 100% sure what my opinion is of that, but it feels like that's going to be a lot lower than what the total need is going to be. When I look at, I don't know if this is finalized, but I did see one list that showed that money's supposed to come out over a 5-year period. The year one allocation to the state of, North Carolina, I believe was in like the $27 million range, which feels woefully below what the need may be.
Considering all those blue dots covered the whole state just about.
Right.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to wrap it up, say a couple of things. So I want to thank the Hazen and Sawyer team that we're working with here. I think that board, as you can tell, as soon as we were aware of these limits and these changes and these houses in front of us, we went into action to start addressing these things. I think it was a good session this evening to give you an overview of the challenges we faced as a utility in chasing our tail on this, but we're on it. We're going to be doing testing. We're going to come up with a testing plan and of course continue down the roadway here to see what we need to do for PFAS contaminants in the water system. I put up on the screen for you just some information that we are pushing out information and have it on our website regarding, PFOA and PFOS. And with our new public information officer on board, Crystal, she's creating a web page for us basically. So we have a landing page for this information as well, can keep the public updated. But again, I think that you start to appreciate the challenges that we're facing. The tests are very expensive as well, something that we'll have to face in the near future. And you also heard some of the challenges of what they're doing with